Hello, Rabbi Klayman here once again. Hanukkah video number 3. Chag Orim Sameach. If you recall, in our last video, we began talking about my Hanukkah. What is the essence? What is the meaning of Hanukkah? And we took a look at 2 of the 4 ancient sources which address the question of Hanukkah, its history, its observance. What we have discovered so far is that there was established a specific date, the 25th of Kislev. We understand that Hanukkah was recognized as an 8-day holiday, originally a substitution for Sukkot, but a holiday which became its own entity in future years. We learned that there was a rededication of the temple, which had been polluted and defiled by Israel's adversaries. We are introduced to the Maccabees, the heroes of the story, and we are introduced to various ritual observances, specifically prayers and hymns of thanksgiving, which became associated with Hanukkah. So that is what we have learned in the first 2 of the 4 ancient sources. What we have not witnessed so far is any reference to the miracle of oil. We did refer to the altar and we did refer to lights, but nothing about any type of miracle. So let's today take a look at the 3rd and the 4th ancient sources which address the question of Hanukkah. The first one we will look at, which is source number 3, is from a work known as Psuke Rabbati. It's a collection of midrashim, of homilies, which generally offer some type of ethical lesson. It was written somewhere around the year 200 of our Common Era, which would be close to 400 years minimally, 400 years if it were written around 200, close to 400 years following the Hanukkah story. So this clearly was a later source, later than the first book of Maccabees and the second book of Maccabees. And this is what we learn in this homiletic collection known as Psikta Rabbati. Why are the lights kindled during Hanukkah? So the question is immediately asked. The text puts the concern for Hanukkah, puts the observance of Hanukkah into a question format, almost like a legal format. At the time, the sons of Hashmon, that is the Maccabees, triumphed over the kingdom of Greece. They entered the temple, and they found there 8 spears of iron, which they grooved out, poured in oil, and kindled wicks. So what do we have here? We have a reference, clear reference to the Maccabees, that the Maccabees were the heroes of the Hanukkah story. We have a historical reference to their victory over the Greeks. So right away, it's established more focus on the history, on the historical origins of Hanukkah. We also learned that they did enter the temple, and we have a reference to oil. 8 spears of iron grooved out, which they had to make into the proper form. They poured oil into them, and they kindled wicks. So we have a very definitive reference to wicks, to oil, to 8 spears. But again, nothing about a miracle. Now here is the second component part of this collection. Another question, why is the Hallel read? If you recall, I mentioned that in the earlier sources, there was a reference to Psalms of Thanksgiving. And we might assume that those Psalms included the Hallel, which is this collection of Psalms offered in praise of God. They are Psalms we recite on various Jewish holidays throughout the year, and as Hanukkah became a substitute for the Sukkot, which was not observed that year during the fighting, Hanukkah time became the occasion for Psalms of Thanksgiving, which would have included this prayer we know as the Hallel. But here in this source, we are asked very specifically, why is the Hallel read? So it is assumed that there is a specific ritual, and that ritual concerns the Hallel. At this time, it was already firmly established that the Hallel prayer was central to Hanukkah observance. And therefore the question assumes that Hallel was read, but now why? Because Hallel is not read except on the overthrow of a foreign government. And since the kingdom of Antiochus continued after the Maccabee battle, Hallel was not said. Since the empire of Greece was eventually destroyed, Hallel is now said. So it's very curious here. We learn that Hallel was often said when an adversary was conquered. But at first, the kingdom of Antiochus continued. And remember, even after the temple, as history progressed, eventually Israel was exiled. Eventually, the land was conquered by the Romans, and Israel would no longer become a nation until 1948. So Hanukkah is a brief episode in the course of time. And when this Midrash collection was written, Israel had already been captured by the Romans, and the Jewish people were in exile, and they were no longer an independent, sovereign nation. But this teaching comes to tell us that since the Greek Empire was eventually destroyed, it was appropriate for us to be able to say Hallel. All that really matters to me in this explanation is the thought that there is no reference to a miracle of oil. Once again, we have a lot of other points of information. We are introduced again to the Maccabees, and we are told that there was oil, but nothing about a miracle. We learn about the ritual, that Hallel became central to Hanukkah, but again, I stress, no miracle of Hanukkah. So where is that miracle? We finally uncover it in the fourth ending, which comes from a section of the Babylonian Talmud, actually the tractate of Shabbat, of the Sabbath, where there are a number of pages specifically referring to Hanukkah and Hanukkah's observance. This is the latest source. Now bear in mind that this is a source written well after the original establishment of Hanukkah. It is written well after the Roman captivity, long after Israel has become exiled, Jews scattered all over, and Israel is no longer an independent, autonomous nation. Bear all that in mind as I read you this fourth and final ending or commentary explanation about the meaning and the origins of Hanukkah. Our sages taught, on the 25th of Kislev begins the 8 days of Hanukkah, which are days on which mourning and fasting are prohibited. So we establish once again the date, the 25th of Kislev. We reaffirm Hanukkah as an 8-day festival, but what is added new, the Chiddush, as they say, is the fact that on these 8 days of Hanukkah, we prohibit all kinds of mourning and fasting. What that means, in terms of fasting, there were days during the course of the year when we would establish, when the Jewish people would establish independent fasts. If there were a time of peril, of national peril, if there were a time of famine, it was customary to establish a day for fasting. Fasting, though, was prohibited on Hanukkah. Hanukkah was to be a joyous holiday. And in addition to that, there would be limited mourning practices. Now, that does not mean we eliminate funerals on Hanukkah. We are permitted to conduct funerals. However, our ritual is somewhat truncated. ritual. We do not recite all of the prayers. There are certain limitations in what we do and what we say. So there is mourning, but there are some limitations which enable us to recognize Hanukkah as a celebration. So that is the innovation here in this first section of the Babylonian Talmud's reference to Hanukkah, that there is no mourning or fasting. Let's go on. For when the Greeks entered the temple, now again historical reference, they defiled all of the oil. A specific reference to oil being defiled. And when the Hasmonean dynasty dedicated them, through the ceremony we now know as Hanukkah, they searched and found only one jug of oil with the official seal of the head Kohen, that is the priest, enough to burn for one day. So we learned that they searched the temple for some kind of oil which had not been defiled, oil which could be lit as part of the temple's dedication. But all they could find was one jar of oil having the official seal of the head priest, meaning that it was acceptable. This could be used to light a fire and dedicate the temple. Now, in the very conclusion of this paragraph, we finally arrive at the miracle. But a miracle happened, and the oil lasted for 8 days. Very simple, declarative statement. There was one jug of oil. It was assumed that that oil would not burn for any kind of extended period of time, but a miracle occurred, and the oil lasted for 8 days. And the teaching concludes, in the following years, these days were appointed as a festival on which Hallel was said. Again, reaffirming the notion of an 8-day holiday, and reaffirming the idea of Hallel, and that Hallel would become a central ritual during the 8 days in our prayer services. We would recite the Hallel prayer. So what about the oil? Why is the oil only introduced at this stage? If you were to celebrate Hanukkah in Israel, unfortunately most of us will not have that opportunity this year, you would notice that the emphasis in many of the celebrations is the military victory over an adversary. Much of the celebration, in fact, some of the songs as well, focus on the military victory, the ability of a small group of people from a small nation overcoming a powerful army, which emphasizes a thought that we say that we chant in one of the haftorahs that we read on Hanukkah: not by might and not by power, but through my spirit, says the God of hosts. In other words, that Hanukkah represents a time of spirit, not a time of power and might. The Maccabees were known for their devotion to God, their intense belief, their strong faith. And here, the miracle is simply a reflection of this notion that God is protecting us, and God is responsible for enabling us to conquer such a strong enemy, because our weapons were spiritual weapons rather than weapons of destruction. But over the course of time, as Hanukkah became an annual observance, remember that Israel was still in a state of flux. Eventually, Rome invaded Israel, and in the year 70, long before this final text was written and was known, was revealed, Israel was no longer an independent nation. The Jewish people were in exile. Israel was under the rule of Rome. So think about it. To celebrate Hanukkah as a military victory over the Greeks would not only make no sense, but would be a cause for sadness, because we would then be observing a holiday that was based on a military victory which we could no longer celebrate since we were living in exile. Imagine celebrating July 4th, living in Europe because America had been destroyed. It would be very difficult for us to celebrate a time of independence, of victory over a foreign army, when we are no longer living an independent existence. And that had to be the same with Israel. To observe a holiday and observe it as a military victory which no longer had any kind of power, no longer provided any real spiritual joy, would be meaningless. So other reasons had to be developed in order to sustain Hanukkah and, in essence, sustain the Jewish people, although they were scattered all over the world. Hence the oil. Because when we speak about oil and we refer to a miracle, it is a miracle of freedom. It is a miracle that is not tied to one specific location, but it's one with universal application. Miracle is the miracle of freedom, but it's not only the freedom of a people to live in their homeland, although that was always the vision of future generations of Jews, but it was the vision of being able to sustain Jewish life, even as Jews were scattered all over the diaspora. The idea of oil resonated with people because they could celebrate Hanukkah as the sustaining of light, a light which represented the light of Jewish experience, of Jewish tradition, of the Jewish people, which could never be extinguished. It was therefore a way to celebrate Hanukkah no matter where Jews lived. You could live anywhere in the world, but wherever you were, you knew that you identified as Jews, and you expressed this identification as Jews by celebrating a holiday which recognizes the indomitable spirit of the Jewish people, our resilience and our irrepressive nature. And so over the course of history, the miracle resonated with every generation of Jews because we could identify with miracle, with freedom, with the light of Jewish survival, no matter where we lived. And that, among other reasons, would explain why the miracle became so central. It was not the original reason for Hanukkah. And don't be discouraged, because over the course of time, we have altered many of our holiday practices. When some practices could no longer be honored due to Israel's exile, we established new ways of celebrating a holiday. We've done that for Passover. We've done that for Shavuot. We've always discovered new ways of celebrating a holiday, and Hanukkah, therefore, is one of them. Originally, it was the celebration of a victory over an imposing army, and that would obviously resonate with Jews living in Israel because it reflects the history of their land. Those of us throughout the world, the oil reminds us that no matter where we are, that Jewish spirit can never be conquered. And I think that is it's a wonderful application of the tradition and a way to celebrate Hanukkah in our time and well beyond. And even though we now enjoy a state of Israel, the miracle of oil and the miracle of Jewish freedom, we still sustain and we observe with a source of pride. So once again, Chag Orim Sameach.